the last video, I discussed what brandy is and covered the bare basics of brandy versus cognac. In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of the lesser known brandies in the world. Now, I know when you mention brandy to most people, their heads will automatically go to cognac. Cognac and brandy, they kind of go hand in hand. But actually, there is way more to the brandy category than cognac. Cognac makes up a significant part of it purely through sales, but when it comes to brands and the amount of different brands out there that produce a brandy, there is a whole different world to explore. Hey brandy lovers, welcome back to the channel. But for those of you that aren't new around these parts, then hello, welcome. My name's Steve the Barman, bartender for 30 years, brandy lover for 25 of those 30 years. But I've never really deep dived into brandy to understand it more. So that is what this channel is all about. Join me on my brandy journey. If you want to learn more, hit that subscribe button. But don't forget, I've now got 5 other YouTube channels, all with their own specific niches, all color coded up. This is the black channel. But if you want even more, check in the description below for all the links of my other channels. So to kick off this video, let's remind ourselves what brandy basically is. Brandy stems from, I think it's the Dutch word for burnt wine, which is essentially means, distilled wine. In that sense of the word. But actually, to deep dive into it a little bit more, brandy basically refers to fermented and distilled fruit juice. So for the bulk of people out there, they will naturally associate grapes as that fruit and that wine as that juice that's been fermented. They will naturally associate brandy with fermented and distilled grape juice. But as I say, there's more to it than that. Because when you think bigger picture, obviously, if you're in the cocktail world, you will have heard cherry brandy and apricot brandy. Now, at this stage, I'm not going to call specific brands out, but some cherry brandies and apricot brandies are authentic. Others are merely just liqueurs. And to dumb that right down, it goes back to what I've just said. Any fruit that's fermented as a juice, or any fruit juice that's been fermented and then distilled, can be called a brandy. But in some cases, we do have a neutral spirit. Let's just call it, we call it NGS in the world, neutral grain spirit. But a lot of spirits, a lot of liqueurs, like a lot of cherry liqueurs, a lot of apricot liqueurs can simply be, fruit infused in neutral grain spirit, infused in vodka. But the authentic ones, the brandies, the cherry brandies, the apricot brandies are actually cherry juice that's been fermented and distilled, or apricot juice that's been fermented and distilled. And this is where brandy gets all confused and, misleading and all that kind of stuff. Because again, in my head, these is the cherry and the apricot is what I refer to as fruit brandies. Even though grape is kind of a brandy, well, it is a fruit, let's be honest. But in my head, I don't know why, whether it's the bartender in me, when I'm talking about fruit brandies, I kind of think of everything except grapes, but grape is a fruit. I don't know. There's no logic to that. But you've got that category, fruit brandies. Basically, any fruit with a high enough sugar content that can be fermented to create its base alcohol and then go on to be distilled is a fruit brandy. And to relate that to some cherry brandies, or cherry liqueurs, I should say, and apricot liqueurs, as I say, a lot of them may not have that high sugar content. So they might just literally be chopped up fruit and macerated, infused into neutral grain spirit. But those that have been fermented and distilled would be called a fruit brandy, or maybe an eau de vie. Now, as I said in the last video, we did talk about cognac and the difference between cognac and brandy. But don't forget, in France, there is also another big category, another big AOC, and that's Armagnac. And Armagnac is very different to cognac. Brandy fans, I'm just going to say that as an overall term, brandy fans will have their own different opinions. That some might think cognac is better, some might think Armagnac is better. Again, there is no right or wrong to that answer. There is no specific cognac is better than Armagnac. They are just different. For example, whereas cognac is distilled, and these are AOC rules. These are French. French are very strict with rules. Think champagne, you know, Calvados, all that sort of stuff that we'll come on to. But brandy has its own rules. So cognac has its own specific rules. Armagnac has its own specific rules. Cognac, distilled in pot stills, twice distilled. Armagnac, distilled in column stills. But let's be brutally honest, Cognac and Armagnac make up two relatively small areas in France. If you make a brandy 500 meters outside of Cognac, 500 meters outside of Armagnac, it's not to say it's any lesser quality. It just legally can't be called Cognac or Armagnac. So therefore, it's just called French brandy. It could be using the exact same grapes, if not very similar grapes. It could be using the similar stills. But the fact is, because it's not made within the AOC region, it can't be classified as Cognac or brandy, or Cognac or Armagnac. So that's my point. Does that make it any lesser quality? How can it do? It's just not allowed to take that name. Now, sticking to France, there's another category of brandy that I'm really looking forward to deep diving because I do love my fruits. And I'll just get one of these out. This is up north, Normandy in France. And if you make apple brandy in Normandy, it can legally be called Calvados. And Calvados, I absolutely adore some of my Calvados apples. Fermented, distilled. If you're in the UK, you'll be like, if you know anything about cider, you will know that cider goes down that route as well. You know, like apples are fermented and then brewed to make cider. Whereas if you ferment apples and then distill it, it then becomes Calvados, or if you're in the UK, apple brandy. So I'm really looking forward to that. But don't, you know, grapes, cognac, brandy, cognac, Armagnac, French brandy, apples. It's just a different base ingredient, but it's still brandy. Now to go all the way over the pond, I don't know why I'm pushing that way, the pond might be that way, but all the way over to you US viewers, then your version of Calvados and English cider brandy or apple brandy or that is obviously Applejack. Applejack is a big, huge thing. I think there's a couple of brands of Applejack I can get here in the UK, so I'm going to be exploring those, but don't see Applejack as any less superior quality than what Calvados is. It's just made in a different region, in a different country, that's all. Now we touched on apples, but let's go back to grapes, and there's a lot of grapes coming out here. But the first grape region that makes brandy that I kind of want to refer to is Spain. If you look at the Sherry Triangle, the Jerez in Spain, they make some phenomenal Spanish brandies as well. Again, do not think that is vastly superior or vastly less superior quality than Cognac and Armagnac. It is just made differently. And sherry lovers, port lovers amongst you will know that, you know, Spain is very good at growing grapes. So are they going to be any less good at making their own brandy? So Spanish brandy is something I'm really excited to explore as well. And of course, they are the big two grape countries closest to me here, France and Spain. But we've also got the US. We've also got Australia. Those big wine producing countries also make brandy. In fact, here's some engagement. If you're watching this, comment below with another country that makes brandy from grape. Now, before you mention Italy, Chile, and Peru, yes, they make some very famous brandy as well, but it comes under two different names. For example, in Italy, if you make a brandy in the traditional Italian way, it becomes grappa. And what grappa is basically all the waste product of making wine. So you've got the skins, you've got the actual pulp, you've got the seeds, and in some cases the stems, the stalks, that all go in to be fermented and distilled relatively unaged. They are aging some parts of grappa, but most grappa is unaged. Of course, that is brandy, but they just call it grappa. And then when we cross over to South America, Chile and Peru, I dare say a few of you watching this, if you're interested in brandy, will have heard of Pisco. Now, I haven't deep dived into the authenticity or where Pisco actually stems from. From my limited knowledge, I know kind of there's an ongoing thing with Peru and Chile of who invented it first. But essentially, see Pisco as a similar style of brandy to what I've just explained with grappa. All that leftover grape stuff, skins, the pulp, the stems, the seeds, kind of gets fermented and then distilled, But for Pisco, again, some Piscos are starting to be aged now, but for most Piscos that you'll know, it's an unaged brandy, maybe rested for a few months, but all those grapes, all that leftover byproduct from making wine, if you're in Chile and Peru, that's Pisco. And I know you've all heard of a Pisco sour as well. Well, you know, for some reason, that's more famous than a brandy sour. But essentially, it's the same thing. But there is one little knowledge bomb I'm going to give you here about Pisco and brandy, Pisco, sorry, from Chile and Peru. And this is my knowledge from yesteryear. And again, I can't wait to deep dive on this. But from my knowledge, I don't know whether I should say this now. Or perhaps I will, because I like being proved wrong. If anyone's got any ulterior or any other knowledge, then make sure you comment below. But when I say Pisco is unaged, it sort of technically is, but it has to be rested for 3 months. Rested, aged, is that different? Is that the same? I don't really know how to classify that. It's the same in rum world. But the key point here is that Pisco cannot be aged in anything that would change the taste. So for all of you that have followed me on my rum journey, where I kind of go on about, you know, I don't really like the taste of like rums that have been heavily oak influenced, heavily wood influenced, you don't get that with Pisco, because even at 3 months, and even those that have been aged longer, you know, they are not aged in wood. Anything that can change the taste of it dramatically by imparting flavour is not allowed. So Pisco is traditionally aged in copper or glass. And when I say aged, again, it's rested. For me, it doesn't kind of class as aged. It's purely rested. So copper, glass won't impart flavour. It'll just let that brandy, that Pisco, mellow. Now in this video, I've covered the bulk of it. I've covered Cognac, I've covered Armagnac, Spanish brandy, US, Australian brandy, fruit brandies from around the world, Pisco and Grappa. If I've missed any category, a glaringly obvious error, then make sure you comment below, give me another type of brandy. But there is one last category that would traditionally be classed as a fruit brandy, but I want to pay homage to it because it's a nostalgic reason for me, because I found this 20 years ago, and that is plum brandy or Slivovitz. Now the reason I mention that is because yes, technically that would come under the fruit brandy kind of label that I said, you know, all those different fruits, you know, brandy is essentially fruit. That's what it is, distilled fruit. But the Balkans do have their own term for it. As I say, you know, Hungary, Bulgaria, all those kind of things, Croatia, if they make it there, you know, they do have their specific term for it. And that's, I'm going to try and say it properly, Rakia, R-A-K-I-A. So that is the overview of brandy. As I say, if I've missed any vital categories out, then please do comment below. But in the next video up there, I'm going to jump back into grape brandy and specifically Cognac and Armagnac and talk about brandy classifications.